Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode in the DJ Anesh series. I've missed all of you, can't wait to see your faces in tutorials this week. It's been 1 month plus, 2 months plus. I hope that your circuit breaker period went well. I hope that your May holidays went well as well. We are truly living in unprecedented times and I am so glad to be able to be experiencing this with you all. It's a season of firsts, many firsts for you and for me. We are conducting many different types of learning and teaching in different forms, and it is truly a high point and a unique point in my career, and I hope it is in your lives as well. Often we, as historians, we look back upon history and we study the great men and women and events of the past. But hey, look at us right now. We are living through history as well. We are history. We are living through a momentous event. 20 years down the road, some of you will become teachers and you will be teaching about this period and you remember this moment where you were living and listening to the DJ Anesh series. I hope that you include me in your lesson plans and you let future generations know that there was a wannabe DJ called DJ Anesh trying to be a hipster and shit and failed to a catastrophic end. Welcome back, guys. I am glad to be able to do the podcast again. Today we are going to be talking about one of the last topics in this subtopic. We are going to be looking at the Cold War in Southeast Asia, and after this we are going to be moving on to another topic called national unity. So this is the last topic that we are really going to be zooming in on politics. The next topic we are going to be looking more towards a socio-political kind of angle towards nation building. So the Cold War in Southeast Asia is one of my favorite topics. You can, and in fact you should, leverage on the material and the content that you have learned in IH for this subtopic as well, because the Cold War that we're talking about here is exactly the same Cold War as you are looking at when you're looking at IH. However, our focus is always on Southeast Asia, so we'll be looking at how the Cold War manifests in the Southeast Asian landscape. We're not going to be so focused on the bipolarity between the US and the USSR, although of course that will be the main backdrop for us to understand what's happening in Southeast Asia. Our focus instead is we are going to be assessing how the Cold War impacts the Southeast Asian political landscape. So the Cold War, we think of it, as that bipolarity, zero-sum game, that kind of animosity between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. But through this topic, the Cold War in Southeast Asia, I want you all to see that the Cold War has more secondary or indirect effects as well. And it can change politics, it can change identity, it can change the fate of the nations and how their destinies are going to be shaped. And it also can determine what kind of political structures and systems governments halfway across the world will adopt. That's the strength of the Cold War and its influence, that it can affect regions that are far away from America and Europe. So that's what our focus is going to be today. Remember, we are looking at Southeast Asia, we are looking at the impact of the Cold War and how it affected the Southeast Asian political landscape. So without further ado, let's go into the podcast, and I hope that you guys will enjoy this one. So today we are looking at the topic of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, looking at the concept of what happens in terms of significance, change and continuity within Southeast Asia when the Cold War happens. When the Cold War begins is not really the concern of the Southeast Asian paper. That one you can kind of like debate in IH. So for me, we will just take it as per normal. It's a post-war situation. We take it as the Cold War influences the rivalry. It already begins from 1945 when World War II ends. But more related to our study is same thing. We look at when Southeast Asian nations become independent, at the point of their independence, how does Cold War shape their politics? Previously, we looked at other factors. We looked at decolonization. We looked at the role of the leaders. We looked at the masses. We looked at traditional political culture. We looked at all different factors, all these other different factors that shaped political development in Southeast Asia. So now we are looking at this additional factor of the Cold War and looking at how it shaped Southeast Asia political development together with the other forces as well. So in terms of essay questions, the Cold War could be set in itself. That means to say that the given factor is the Cold War and you have to analyze the entire essay on it, or the Cold War could be seen in conjunction with the other factors, and then you're supposed to do like a relative assessment, a weighing or evaluation of which force seemed to be more influential in determining the political development in Southeast Asia. So that's going to be our focus for today. For this topic and this lesson, I would use this essay question to kind of guide our scope, to guide our direction as well. And this essay question will be the one that we are going to be discussing in tutorials this week as well. So towards the end of the podcast, I'll give you all some instructions on this. Syllabus document, you can see that we are at the end of this subtopic. We've done the rest already. Now we're looking at the Cold War context. So this is just for us to track where we are at in terms of this. Now, the argument and the framework that I want to present to you guys when we assess the Cold War impact is that I want to keep it as broad as possible. I want to see the variety of the ways in which the Cold War could have impacted the Southeast Asian political landscape. So I present to you this framework where I look at the Cold War effects on the national level, and I look at the Cold War effects on the regional level. And within these categories of national and regional, there are some sub-points for you all to take note. Now, in the exam condition, it's best, if you have time and all that, present both levels. I think that would be good to show sophistication in your essay, that you can show the influence as nuanced, and there's a great variety to it. However, if you're running short of time between these two, the one that is more priority will be looking at the national level kind of developments, because that's always going to be the main focus for this topic. So what I would suggest is that you see your time management and all that. And Mr. Chia is here. Hi, Mr. Chia. I'm doing a podcast right now, J1 podcast. You want to say hi? No, he doesn't want to say hi, he just left. Okay, now going back to this, let's unpack the national and the regional a bit. Now, with the national level kind of influences, I also want to show that there is a variety of how the Cold War impacted the various countries. So I want to look at comparative analysis once again. I'm going to group my case studies based on how the Cold War affected them, how the Cold War influenced them. I'm looking at trends, looking at similarities, differences. Now, the first one, I'm going to say that the Cold War strengthened or established authoritarian forms of governments, and even strengthened the idea of militarism. So there are some case studies for that. Later we will go into that. The second one is that a bit different, like not as severe or not as extreme as the first set of case studies, but the second set of case studies is that the Cold War helped to justify the authoritarian modification of democracies. So there's a separate set of case studies for that. Later we'll go into that as well. And the last one is that I want to think about the other side. Often we think about US and we think about the effects that it had on its allies, but I want to think about the Soviet Union as well, and the effect that the Soviet Union and even possibly China has on its allies and its bloc. So the third one is that the Cold War, the influence, it also led to the setup and the solidification of communist governments, most notably Vietnam. So that's a separate case study over there as well. So that's the national level framework. You can see that with these 3 points, I actually can run an entire essay on it already. But if I have time and if I want to push myself, let's consider the regional effects, the regional political development. Now, most ostensibly, most obviously, the Cold War led to the formation of several attempts at regional organizations, most notably SEATO, the Five Power Defense Arrangements, the Non-Aligned Movement, and arguably ASEAN. So we'll go into that as well later on. But you can see the framework that I have over here. Let's say, for instance, if you are looking at the significance, the concept of significance of the Cold War, then you can see that it is pretty significant. Its influence was varied. It cut across both national as well as regional levels. So all these things, it builds into your argument about how significant Cold War is, or the various ways in which the Cold War was significant. So, just going into the case studies, presenting to you a broad overview of the case studies for each of the points that I mentioned just now. Going into comparative analysis, remember the first point that I have just now on the national level is that it strengthened and established authoritarian regimes and cultures of militarism. I'm going to ask you guys to stare at these faces right now, or to stare at the map. And I hope, give me some hope, guys, that you know who these people are, that at one glance you can immediately identify all these people right here, these case studies that you can use to sustain this point and this TS of how the Cold War helped them to establish their authoritarian governments and enhance that culture of militarism within Southeast Asian political culture. So hopefully you know them, but if you don't, I'm gonna go clockwise. If you can imagine, starting from 1 o'clock, you have Marcos at the top right. I'm going to skip the second photo for a while. I'm going to go down to the bottom right, and that is Thailand. We are looking at Sarit. Then on the bottom left, we are looking at Suharto, and then the wait a minute. Okay, some technical difficulties there. Even I got my names wrong. So let's go one more time again. The top right is Marcos in the Philippines. The bottom right is actually in South Vietnam. We are looking at characters like Nording Diem, Bao Dai. Over in the bottom left, you have Suharto from Indonesia. And over in the top left, you are looking at Thailand, looking at Sarit. So these are the case studies that you can think about when you think about the Cold War influence. Now you can see that the center right, there is a picture of a guy that I didn't mention, and the line to him is red. And the guy is Ne Win, and the case study is Burma. Honestly, I don't think that Burma was that influenced by the Cold War in terms of their movement towards authoritarianism. I feel that they were more motivated by their own domestic politics rather than by an influence of the Cold War. So when it comes to case study management and selecting your best case studies, I feel that there are always going to be some cases that are better suited to the point than others. So even though Burma moves towards authoritarianism, I might not use Burma as a case study to run a Cold War point. I might use Burma as a case study to run a domestic issues point, but I don't think I would choose Burma for a Cold War point. So that's something for you guys to consider. For the next point on the authoritarian modifications of democracies, we are looking at, of course, the case studies of Singapore and Malaysia. And the last point, when we are looking at the setup of communist governments, of course, we are looking at the case study of North Vietnam and then later on the reunified Vietnam. When it comes to the regional level impact from the Cold War, we are looking at the setup of regional organizations as a response to the Cold War. So the first one that I'm looking at right here is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO for short. Formed in 1954, there are two Southeast Asian nations in this organization, Thailand and the Philippines. And you might ask why? Well, most obviously is because these two nations were the two Southeast Asian nations that were allied to the US. There's a formal alliance between Thailand and the US, as well as Philippines and the US. So many viewed SEATO as a proxy organization. You might find the name familiar because it's meant to be a counterpart to NATO back in Europe. So you can see that this organization is one that is to serve Cold War purposes. One is to help the sphere of influence and the bipolarity and all that kind of stuff on the Western side. So the ironic thing about SEATO is that the name is Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, but yeah, only two members in this organization are from Southeast Asia. The rest are not from Southeast Asia. You can try to take a look at the flags and guess where these other nations of this organization is from. As I mentioned, Thailand and the Philippines are militarily allied to the US, so there are US military assets in Thailand and Philippines. Here you can see air bases, US air bases all across Thailand. You have naval base. Even in Singapore and Malaysia, because the colonial power there was the British was allied to the Americans, so there's a Cold War link over there. And even with Singapore and Malaysia, we did sign the Five Power Defense Arrangement that lasts actually all the way till today. But you can see that even the British, who are on the Western Bloc side, they have military assets in Singapore and Malaysia. So here you have naval bases, you have an airfield, and so on and so forth. So these are organizations that are sparked off from the Cold War, and they kind of belong to the Western Bloc side. So you can tell quite obviously that they are meant to serve some sort of Cold War purpose, some sort of proxy purpose, if you will. However, there are other organizations that are in response to the Cold War, but they seek to distance themselves from the Cold War. So the non-aligned movement are a group of countries that came together and says, no, I don't want your shit, like you guys go and deal with your own superpower politics, but leave us out of it. We are the non-aligned. So remember, in the world of Cold War, there's bipolarity, you're either on this side or the other side. The non-aligned movement says, no, wait, we have a third way, we have a choice. We are going to be distancing ourselves from this superpower, bipolarity, and rivalry that is happening. So the non-aligned movement is born out of a response to the Cold War, but it is meant to distance itself from the Cold War. The non-aligned movement, why is it relevant to us? Because one of the leaders in the non-aligned movement, you can see in the picture over here, is actually Sukarno from Indonesia. Sukarno was fiercely anti-imperial, he was fiercely anti-Western, and he was fiercely independent in that sense. So you can understand why he would be one of the leading members in the non-aligned movement. And the last one, this one I leave it up in question, ASEAN. It is still debatable, even to this day, what are the motivations behind the formation of ASEAN. But given, you can see the date here, 1967, when ASEAN is formed, it is in the heat of the Vietnam War. And it is a collection of 5 non-communist countries coming together. So definitely, I think there is a measure of Cold War influence there. But how much, I think I leave it up to you to debate. The 5 founding members, as you can see over here, these 5 spot the mistake over here. Yes, over there. S. Rajaratnam from Singapore, Tanak Koman from Thailand, Adam Malik from Indonesia, Tun Razak from Malaysia, and Nasisco Ramos from Philippines. So these are the 5 foreign ministers. These are the 5 foreign ministers of the 5 nations, the 5 founding members of ASEAN. I do think that there is a measure of Cold War influence over there. So you see, Southeast Asia, when it enters independence, it enters a huge complex web of Cold War politics as well. So on top of all the national issues they have to deal with, right, there is this dominating external influence that is imposing itself onto the region, and it cuts across so many lines, and it drives home the point that Southeast Asia is a region of complexity, it is a region of diversity. There's nothing simple about Southeast Asia, which is why the skill in Southeast Asian studies for you is comparative analysis. How do you make sense of the complexity? What trends can you see? Similarities, differences, all these things, it will go into helping you to structure your argument and your own views. This is just one region in the world, and there's such huge complexity there. Can you imagine the rest of the world? Western Europe, Eastern Europe, South America, North Africa, so on and so forth. Everywhere is caught up in such bipolarity. But thankfully for our case, we are only looking at Southeast Asia. So, I want to go more specifically into the points that I have with regards to how the Cold War shapes national political development. The first one that I want to look at, and the set of case studies that I'm looking at, are authoritarian regimes and case studies that exhibit a high level of militarism. So, one of the overriding objectives of the Cold War that I need you all to understand, especially from the US point of view, is that they are staunchly anti-communist. Okay? They are staunchly anti-communist. That's more or less the overriding principle of US foreign policy back then. Okay? Staunchly anti-communist. So, when you try to unpack this, right, you can see that this doesn't necessarily mean that you as a government, like anywhere in the world, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be democratic. I know the natural association is US equals democracy, but in this case, in this special context of the Cold War, it didn't mean that you needed to be a democracy. All you needed to be was an anti-communist government. It doesn't matter what type of government you are, as long as you exhibit policies and philosophies of anti-communism. So, there is your link towards understanding why the Cold War, and especially the US, it seems a bit conflicting, or it seems ironic, but there's your link to understand why the Cold War, why the US could have prompted the movement towards authoritarianism. You would have thought that the US would prompt the movement towards democracy, but the reality is stranger than fiction. And we are seeing how the US actually prompts the movement towards authoritarian forms of government. So, that is the kind of the link and the impact that we have between Cold War politics and domestic national political development. So, what exactly, how can you phrase it? What exactly did the Cold War do? It legitimized and facilitated the rise of authoritarian regimes and maximum governments. This facilitation, right, either it can be from the US point of view. So, the US would provide things like military aid, financial aid, diplomatic support. They throw their entire weight behind these governments and so on and so forth. So, it kind of gives that government a good degree of stability, a good degree of resources as well to remain in power. And it really, the US kind of like lends its legitimacy. The US lends its credibility to these governments. And so these governments, they have some currency to, stay in power. So that's one way of doing things. But I think looking at that point of view only would, is a Western centric kind of perspective. I want you to look at it from the Southeast Asian point of view as well. How did the Southeast Asian governments themselves have the agency? How did they use the Cold War? So it's not a one-way traffic. The Southeast Asian governments themselves, they also used the Cold War. So what they did was, how many governments have we come across already where they use communism as a justification or as a pretext or as some sort of reason for them to increase their powers or to depart from democracy and to establish their authoritarian forms of government, where they pride or where they continue to, hone in on the point that national security is of the utmost importance. We need stability and so on and so forth. We have to prevent the communists from taking over, blah, blah, blah. A lot of all these things, right, it stems from the grand idea of Cold War politics in the first place. Without that context, without that setting, all these governments, they wouldn't be able to play this card. And once this context was set, they were able to play this card. So a lot of these governments, they moved into more authoritarian forms based on the idea of national stability. So as much as the Cold War was making its impact felt in these countries, so too did these countries make use of the Cold War. And together, when you look at these two movements, you can present a more holistic understanding of why the Cold War facilitated, or why the Cold War helped to establish authoritarian forms of government. I have 3 case studies for you, and I'll leave you to check it out. But these 3 case studies are my 3 best case studies where there is a sizable communist threat, or there is a sizable alliance between that country and the US. And together, these 2 things combine to really spur forth the movement towards authoritarianism. So it conforms to the points that I raised over here, these 3 case studies. So you can read the case studies for their specific details, but it all comes back to these points that I raised over here, how it helps to change and how it helps to facilitate the political development in these countries. So 3 countries, looking at Thailand, I give you case studies, Phibun, Sarit, Tanom, give you Indonesia as well, looking at case study of Suharto, and lastly, I give you the case study as well of South Vietnam, where we're looking at the figure of Ngo Dinh Diem. Speaking of Ngo Dinh Diem, I think he's a great case study, together with Marcos perhaps, of how Americans conceptualized their foreign policy back then. So, as I mentioned just now, the Americans, when they looked towards all these governments across the world, they needed to know whether they could trust these governments or whether they could support these governments. But more crucially, they needed to know whether these governments could contain the communists. And Marcos and Diem, these people, they were US proxies in a sense, and the US threw their weight behind them initially. However, as time wore on, these 2 leaders became hugely unpopular with the local population. And because these 2 leaders had such strong American ties, America was very, very worried about the kind of reputation, the kind of fallout that it would have on America itself, these leaders being increasingly unpopular. So over time, Americans, the American government, they would distance themselves from governments like these, and they would be looking to intervene to change the government. So intervention can come in many forms. For the Marcos case, Americans withdrew their support, and basically Marcos had lost all credibility and he had to flee the country. So that's the Mao form of intervention. For Diem's case, however, it's a lot worse because there are accusations of the US through the CIA organizing his assassination. So Diem was actually assassinated, and many links points towards it being a covert CIA operation. So I want you to see that Cold War politics is very, very, very dirty, and Cold War politics is very, very, very hypocritical. So there is nothing simple about Cold War politics, and perhaps this mindset you can have for IH as well as you study Cold War politics, especially in how they extended beyond Europe to other case studies. The next set of case studies and the next point we are looking at in terms of political development, it's not as extreme as the setup of authoritarian governments or growing the culture of militarism and things like that. But nonetheless, we can see a visible political development as well. We are looking at the authoritarian modifications to democracies. So for these case studies, I accept and I establish that they are overall democracies. The system is intact, there are democratic elements, and so on and so forth. So I accept that that's the case for these case studies, but I do note that the Cold War does prompt certain movement towards authoritarianism as well. So once again, we are looking at overriding objectives of the Western Bloc. But because the case studies here are Singapore and Malaysia, perhaps I can still talk about the US, but maybe I want to emphasize more on Britain and its special relationship or its alliance with the US as well, and how that affected these case studies. Same thing, same principle as the first set of case studies. We saw that many of them use communism as a justification. They use the threat of social instability as a justification to move into more authoritarian forms. Over here, we are looking more at legislation, things like the Internal Security Act, or things like having more censorship in the press, in media, this kind of things. So these are anti-liberal kind of movements. So we can classify them as authoritarian modifications. Does it overall compromise on the integrity of democracy? Personally, I don't think so, which is why I can craft my TS and my point like this, where I talk about how these democracies, they are not liberal democracies. There are certain authoritarian modifications, and these modifications were prompted by Cold War influence. So that's something that is a bit nuanced and is a bit different from the first set of case studies. Again, two examples that I'm giving you over here. You can read the details for yourself. But of course, we are talking about Lee Kuan Yew and the Tengku governments for these two case studies. Okay. And the last one over here that I have for you guys is looking at the other side of bipolarity, looking at the other side of the camp. We are looking at the communist governments and the communist bloc. So as much as we see the Western Bloc exerting their influence, so too are the Soviet bloc exerting their influence. And most prominently in Southeast Asia, we are looking at how the effects are being made onto the case study of Vietnam. So same principles, we are looking at how the Soviet Union or even China, they are looking to exert their influence, and it's a competition, right, with the US, and there is a zero-sum game. Whatever the US is doing, we must do it as well, we must do it even better, and so on and so forth. So that kind of competition for spheres of influence or for bloc alignments, we are seeing in the Soviet camp as well. Most prominently, we can see this in the case study of Vietnam. So ironically enough, the Cold War did further establish or did give more credibility to the Vietnamese Communist Party. Same thing. I want you to consider that from one perspective, you are seeing the Soviet camp or China or whoever, they are supporting Vietnam. So a lot of military aid, a lot of financial aid, diplomatic support, and so on and so forth is pouring to Vietnam and to the Vietnamese Communist Party. So there's that angle of it. But I want you all to see how the Vietnamese Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh and his leaders, how they made use of Cold War to further entrench their nationalist credentials. One of the big things that emerges out of the Vietnam War or the Vietnam Wars is that the Vietnamese Communist Party, increasingly they were associated with nationalism, and they made use of the Cold War in order to entrench this association, such that by the end of the Vietnam War, the one with the Americans in 1975, the Vietnamese Communist Party was seen as credible, legitimate government, because all other forms of governments, they were already tainted with accusations of foreign influence, US intervention. All these kind of negative qualities were associated with other parties. But the Vietnamese Communist Party were able to state explicitly and with evidence, I guess, that they were the ones fighting for Vietnam. They were the ones defending the honor of the nation and blah blah blah, those kind of stuff. And again, it's a Cold War influence partly that helps the Vietnamese Communist Party to establish this. Of course, maybe in Vietnam, this influence is a lot higher, considering that they had a unique situation, which is active warfare. So this is something that you can run in a Vietnam paragraph, because currently we don't really have another communist case study to pair up with Vietnam. So a whole paragraph of Vietnam explaining all these unique circumstances and how special this case study is, but yet the Cold War influence was still significant over there. You can run it by a paragraph by itself. So that's something for you to consider as well. So today I've talked about and focused on the national level kind of developments, and given the focus that we have today on significance, I want you all to go back and consider this essay question. Come to tutorials on Thursday and Friday with a simple outline, because in class I want us to be discussing this. As always, I think that I learn a lot from you guys as well. So come prepared, so that besides whatever I have shared in today's podcast, perhaps there are fresh insights. And I always encourage you guys, please, to go beyond what I provide you, to think for yourselves as well, because quite often you can benefit me and you can benefit your classmates as well with your fresh perspectives and insights, something that I couldn't see or something that I did not see. I think learning is a two-way process from me and from you. So let's get it down. Thanks guys for listening to today's podcast. Welcome back to school. Let's ease into term 3. Pace yourselves, take care of yourselves, stay healthy. It's a long term, but if we are going to do it, we do it together. And if we do it together, I'm sure that we will make it out all fine and dandy. Thank you once again. I will see you all in tutorials. DJ Anesh out.